Happy 200th birthday, Charles Dickens! And welcome to our celebration of his life and works. The stories and characters created by Charles Dickens have touched us all. My own first turn as an amateur thespian was the role of Marley in a 4th grade production of A Christmas Carol. Yet it wasn't until my MA comprehensive exams that I first read Dickens seriously. Professor Fisher, plug your ears. For though I loved Dickens' riotous sense of humor, painfully slow reader that I am, I couldn't finish it in time for the exam. Thankfully, I knew how to bluff. Now you can. But I'm glad I came back to it later, and I did finish it, and now I routinely turn to Dickens as my traveling companion on my daily commute. Later in grad school, I found my way to Rare Book School at the University of Virginia, where I sat at the feet of many of the world's leading experts on book history. They emphasized that a book is something you can pick up and hold in your hands. Every aspect of a book influences the way we understand it. The physical forms in which texts appear affect and even mold their meanings and their impact. Typography, illustration, book bindings, paper, readers' annotations may all be read as meaningfully as the words themselves, and can lead us to a richer and fuller appreciation for the significance and the social contexts of any book we may encounter. Dickens is a locus classicus for this principle. Many of his novels, including Bleak House, were issued in parts, monthly installments in printed paper wrappers consisting of 4 chapters and 2 illustrations each. If your modern edition lacks the illustrations by Phiz or Cruikshank, you have not experienced Dickens the way his contemporaries did. If you read Dickens in a modern 1-volume mass-market paperback, or a typical e-text, you may be mystified by the rising and falling action created by the climactic hook at the end of every 4th chapter. If the divisions of the monthly installments aren't marked in your edition, as they are in this Penguin, you may have little sense of eager anticipation with which Victorian readers awaited the next installment over a period of 19 months. Think Harry Potter hysteria. Each installment was priced at an affordable 1 shilling. At a time when the typical Victorian novel was sold in 3 volumes at the artificially inflated price of £1.50 guineas, 31 shillings and 6pence. The price differential was something like that for our younger audience members, like that between buying a CD download and shelling out for the iPod to play it on. One more surprising aspect of the original Dickens in parts are the advertisements. And while the adverts may have little direct bearing on the narrative, they serve as markers of class and status. Perhaps they even say something about anticipated readership, and perhaps even further, some clue as to what it was like to read Dickens for the first time. What is tempted to deploy the lit-crit jargon carnivalesque. On the inside back cover of the first part of Bleak House is this remarkable advert by a copywriter who surely had not read the novel yet. Anti-Bleak House. A bleak house that is indeed, where the north winds meet to howl an ignoble concert, and bitter blasts mourn like tortured spirits of rebels, who, though prisoners, are unsubdued. Where the whirlwind and the hurricane vow their vengeance, and the walls and timbers creak resistance, and like wounded gladiators rise again boldly to defy the antagonist. Woe to the inhabitant of the bleak house, if he is not armed with the weapons of an overcoat and a suit of fashionable, substantial clothing, such as can only be obtained at E. Moses and Sons establishment, New Oxford Street and Hart Street, London. With his carefully drawn studies of character and motivation, his remarkable gift for both humor and pathos, his masterly use of language, and especially, I think, his keen insights into the consequences of individual human choices for ill and for good in the lives of others, Dickens remains profoundly relevant today. By collecting his works and making them available for research, study, and classroom use, one of the things we do here in Special Collections is to help give Georgetown students a window into a fuller appreciation for this greatest of all English novelists. I hope you enjoy the festive series of Dickensian entertainments we have prepared for you this afternoon as we celebrate Charles Dickens at Georgetown, from his campus visit in 1842 to the donation of our Dickens collection in the 1970s to faculty research and student encounters with his works today. First up is Leona Fisher, an associate professor in the English department. Professor Fisher earned her bachelor's at Stanford and her PhD at the University of California, Santa Barbara. In addition to many other areas of expertise, Professor Fisher is a Dickens scholar and a longtime exuberant teacher of Dickens for undergraduate and graduate students at Georgetown. We are delighted to welcome Professor Fisher to represent the scholars and teachers featured in the exhibition and the vital role which they have played and continue to play in the university curriculum. Professor Fisher.
Very nice introduction. I'm actually going to start today by asserting that I have a certain amount of authority in the matter of Dickens because I'm old as the Dickens. And because I've been here for nearly 40 years doing this kind of work, there is a certain amount of heft behind me as I make these remarks. There is no way to be as enthusiastic for Dickens as he was for himself. And this is a very good starting place, I think, for talking about him today. The celebratory things that one can say about Dickens are virtually endless. I've been given 10 minutes, there's not a prayer. The first thing I want to say about Dickens is that he was a series of paradoxes, and that his own relationship to himself, because I'm going to talk about relationships today, his own relationship to himself was both vexed and very self-confident. He was an amazing combination of hubris and humility, of anger and compassion, of fragmentation. In fact, K. Redfield Jameson has speculated that he was bipolar, and that there were all kinds of pieces of evidence in his life that had to do with certainly with his manic behaviors, but also with his depressions. And since he claimed always to walk 15 miles a day, there is something almost supernatural about both his physical energy and his mental energy. He was, in fact, a series of contradictions, but at the same time he had goals for himself. He had a relationship to himself that was almost superhuman. After he had visited Venice, for example, he wrote to his friend John Forster, "When I saw those Venetian places, how I thought that to leave one's hand upon the time, lastingly upon the time, with one tender touch for the mass of toiling people that nothing could obliterate, would be to lift oneself above the dust of all the doges in their graves, and stand upon a giant staircase that Samson couldn't overthrow. Remarkable, and probably about as accurate a description of his stature in the modern world, and perhaps into the future, as anything that has been said about Dickens. So that's the first thing, the relationship of Dickens to himself. The second thing I want to talk about is the relationship of Dickens to America, and specifically, as you've heard, to Georgetown. Michael Slater, his recent biographer, though not the most recent, the biographies continue, writes, quote, "America had long been a place in his mind, as it was for so many of his fellow countrymen, a utopia for the radicals and a dystopia for the Tories," end quote. Dickens was to be deeply disappointed in this experiment that he saw as the answer to so many of England's own troubles and questions, particularly in relation to the working classes and to the egalitarian goals that he had for his own country. He wrote to his friend Macready, "This is not the republic I came to see. This is not the republic of my imagination." He described to both Macready, who was an actor, and to John Forster, the ultimate failure of America's example to the earth, end quote. This was doomed, of course, to offend just about everyone. So he had to go back and write a sort of upbeat, but then also doomed to be criticized, follow-up to American Notes, Martin Chuzzlewit, in which his satirical thrust against American enterprise and attitudes and culture was not to be a success on this side of the water, though he maintained relationships with people here in the United States for many years and returned to the United States late in his career. In relation to Georgetown, he was very fair. He came, he saw Georgetown, and he describes it thus, despite the fact, by the way, that he describes Rome during Holy Week as engaging in, quote, unmitigated humbug. So you can imagine what Dickens's attitudes toward the Roman Catholic Church might have been. This is his description of our institution, however. Not quite the way it was quoted earlier in the memory, but, quote, "At Georgetown in the suburbs, there is a Jesuit college. Delightfully situated, and so far as I had an opportunity of seeing, well managed. Many persons who are not members of the Romish Church avail themselves, I believe, of these institutions and of the advantageous opportunities they afford for the education of their children." Could you give me water? The heights in this neighborhood, the heights, right, the hilltop, above the Potomac, above the Potomac River are very picturesque. Turn around and see. Not quite what Dickens saw. He also seems not to have noticed the swamp, but and are free, I should concede, from some of the insalubrities of Washington. He's talking about the weather, but he had some things to say about Congress, too. The air at that elevation was quite cool and refreshing, when in the city it was burning hot. Dickens did control himself in American Notes, but not so you'd notice. When he wasn't critiquing the atrocious American habit of chewing tobacco and missing the spittoon, or being appalled at the brutalizing effects of slavery, as when he left Richmond, for example, quote, "with a grateful heart that I was not doomed to live where slavery was, and had never had my senses blunted to its wrongs and horrors in a slave-rocked cradle," end quote. He would, in fact, cut short his trip at Richmond and not go as far as Charleston because he didn't think that he could stand to see much more evidence of what he was experiencing. When he wasn't doing that, he was describing hilariously the satirical, in a satirical vein, the behaviors of Americans who he felt didn't know how to eat, didn't know how to socialize or talk, didn't have any manners, and were forever spitting on his new fur coat. He in fact theorized on a boat trip to Cincinnati that Americans, quote, expectorate in dreams. Because when he got up in the morning, he had to wash off his coat on the deck before he could put it back on. I'm going to indulge you with a quick reading that is my favorite from American Notes. I find it absolutely hilarious, and it's an image that's perfect because it is it's a metaphor that becomes a very alive version of the way that he perceived Americans, but it's also very appropriate because it's written by a literary person. I have mentioned, he says, my having been in some uncertainty and doubt at first relative to the sleeping arrangements on board this boat. I remained in the same vague state of mind until 10 o'clock or thereabouts, when going below, I found suspended on either side of the cabin 3 long tiers of hanging bookshelves, designed apparently for volumes of the small octavo size. Bitty books, very small bookshelves. Looking with greater attention at these contrivances, wondering to find such literary preparations in such a place, I descried on each shelf a sort of microscopic sheet and blanket. Then I began dimly to comprehend that the passengers were the library, and that they were to be arranged edgewise on these shelves till morning. He goes on. I found, and this is in reference to his own shelf, I found it on after measurement just the width of an ordinary sheet of Bath Post letter paper. And I was at first in some uncertainty as to the best means of getting into it. But the shelf being a bottom one, I finally determined on lying upon the floor, rolling gently in, stopping immediately I touched the mattress, and remaining for the night with that side uppermost, whatever it might be. Luckily, I came upon my back at exactly the right moment. I've loved that for years, and I've actually quoted it from memory to students. So, his relationship to himself, his relationship to America, and his relationship to me. I first read Dickens at age 12 when my mother, who noticed that I was a reader inordinately fond of Nancy Drew, decided it was time for me to read something rather more canonical and handed me Great Expectations. I think she had great expectations. They were foiled. At age 15, I read A Tale of Two Cities. And I read it again in graduate school where we called it, excuse me for this, A Sale of Two Titties. But at 15, it certainly went over my head in almost every way. And I was actually a history aficionado, so in fact, I knew a lot about the French Revolution, but the book didn't grip me. At age 20 in college, I read Hard Times. That was my first studying of Dickens in any systematic way. None of it registered much, although I did have an epiphany in college that I was going to become a Victorianist someday. In graduate school, I made the mistake of deciding that one of my areas of qualifying exam for the PhD was going to be Charles Dickens. I was told that might be a lot, but I did read everything, including most of the journalism, which of course fills volumes of household words and all the year round. And at the end of the experience, as I was preparing for the exam, I became very depressed because it was over and it was never going to be new again. At one point in my career at Georgetown, I counted how many times I've read Great Expectations, and it turns out I've read it at least 32 times in the course of the almost 40 years here, because it has to be reread and savored each time. So at Georgetown, I developed a new kind of relationship to Dickens. In my second semester, I taught a course called Dickens, Thackeray, and Eliot. It seemed like the big ones, and I decided it was important, in which I taught Great Expectations and Bleak House as two of 7 books that semester. In the 1970s, I gave a talk to the Library Associates on Dickens in America, which went on forever. I promise this won't. I still have a tape of it somewhere, but I've never had the courage to listen. In the fall of 1975, I taught a course on Dickens, including 7 novels. Think about that for a minute. 7 novels in 13 weeks. I've had a thorny career with Dickens. 10 years after I taught that course, I received a vicious letter from one of the students in that course explaining to me that I had ruined Dickens for him forever because of requiring him to read all of these 800 to 900 page novels. And that was also the course in which a student said, "Oh, I can't answer that question. I've barely begun. I'm only on page 450. In the early 2000s, I started to teach a graduate course on Dickens, and it was the most remarkable experience. Students actually devoted to reading Dickens. Even if they were skeptical at first, they became so. And I taught several times an advanced undergraduate seminar with self-selected students who were completely into the experience and were willing to write every single week on Dickens and to give oral reports on aspects of the novels and ultimately to write potentially publishable 20 to 25 page final papers. I mean, Dickens evokes that kind of passion once he hooks into your life and becomes a relationship to you. In the midst of all this, I was also doing scholarship on Dickens, including the edition of Mr. Nightingale's diary that is on display out there, I understand, an essay on Charles Dickens and children, because he was a great player with children, and the Lemon family, whom I got to know when I was working on the edition, shared all kinds of correspondence and anecdotes about Dickens from their great-great-grandfather. And I also wrote an essay on Mark Lemon's plays and the woman question. And they're very, very funny and very interesting. Dickens, in fact, I know I was originally built to talk about Dickens' plays. Dickens' plays are in the novels. Dickens' best plays are in the novels. They do not bear the kind of scrutiny that a whole talk might have to give them. And out of this has come my current research interest, which is children's literature. Because, in fact, as we all know, the most important thing about Dickens is that he is relevant. And I want to talk here about his relationship in some ways to the present and even to the future. First of all, stylistically, enormously innovative, both sentimental and very frequently grotesque, with startling openings. You could remember the openings to those novels, with those characteristic as-if similes that just knock you out and make you think for days. The satirical bite, the narrative innovation that he comes up with, the invention really of the first-person voice, the combined narration of something like Bleak House, all of that stylistically. And in the old days, that was what we preferred to do, was to read texts in a new critical fashion, stylistically looking closely at them, doing close textual analysis. His topics, I can't even begin. Lawyers in courts, child abuse, schools, child death, prostitution, criminals and debtors, public hangings, prisons and workhouses, the invention of detectives, sanitation, science, the city, manufacturing and its abuses, treatment of the laboring classes, greed and the distortion of character, love, hate, psychological obsession, revolution and reform, theater and theatricality, dreams and nightmares, paranormal activities, and on and on and on. There's something for everybody in Dickens. There is also an approach that any rich novelist, and Dickens is, without question, the best. I'm very fond of saying that Our Mutual Friend is my favorite Dickens novel, right? And that Great Expectations is my favorite novel. So, but what I've loved about teaching Dickens is that I have been able to use every new critical approach possible in reading these texts. They invite it. The old ways, as I said, included stylistic analysis, new critical, close textual work, and biographical criticism, if you go back to the early part of the 20th century, but also into the end of the century. But in the modern era, when all sorts of other critical approaches have been invented, Dickens actually includes them. They're embedded in Dickens' own prose and way of looking at the world. These include Freudian, psychoanalytic, Lacanian analysis, Marxist criticism, feminist criticism, new historicist and old historicist criticism, reader response approaches, deconstruction, performance theory. It's all there. It's not something that has to be imposed upon him as if, right, he hadn't somehow anticipated all of that in his capacious imagination and ability really to take over his world, to describe it in a way that renders him both, paradoxically, the quintessential Victorian and a man of any era, right, as each era comes along. So finally, I would like to read a small passage that was written the last day of Dickens' life. Since we're celebrating his birth, this is his relationship to his future. And this is chapter 23 of The Mystery of Edwin Drood, written the day before he died, the day of his stroke, and just hours before he succumbed. A brilliant morning, just as today is, a brilliant morning shines on the old city. This is Rochester, Cloistrum. Its antiquities and ruins are surpassingly beautiful, with a lusty ivy gleaming in the sun, and the rich trees waving in the balmy air. Changes of glorious light from moving boughs, songs of birds, scents from gardens, woods, and fields, or rather from the one great garden of the whole cultivated island in its yielding time, penetrate into the cathedral, subdue its earthy odor, and preach the resurrection and the life. The cold stone tombs of centuries ago grow warm, and flecks of brightness dart into the sternest marble corners of the building, fluttering there like wings.
Now I'd like to yield the floor to the co-curator of our exhibition, John Pfordresher, and his two fellow performers, who will present a scene for us in keeping with the long tradition of Dickens' own public readings of his works. John Pfordresher is a professor in the English department where he teaches both graduate and undergraduate classes on Charles Dickens, among many other subjects. He earned his BA from Georgetown and his PhD from the University of Minnesota. John has consistently been one of the most enthusiastic faculty supporters of special collections during my time here, and we are truly grateful for his help in making this event and exhibition possible, above and beyond the call of duty, John. Thank you. David Gewanter is a professor in the English department where he teaches poetry and creative writing. He is author of 3 books of poetry and co-editor of the collected poems of Robert Lowell. His work has appeared in numerous publications, and he's received many awards for his poetry. Prior to coming to Georgetown, David headed the writing programs at Harvard. He earned his MA and PhD at the University of California, Berkeley. Catherine Payling is an adjunct instructor in the Department of Performing Arts, where she teaches cultural sector management. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Prior to coming to Georgetown, Catherine was director of the Keats Shelley House Museum in Rome for 14 years, and Catherine, we're delighted to have you here. John?
Okay, thank you. I think we're going to stand. Is that right? Is that okay?
We're standing.
We're standing. We don't have to. As John pointed out, Charles Dickens himself got into the practice of performing selections from his novels for the public, and did so for much of the latter third of his life. But his novels were also read aloud in family settings, and I want to suggest that that's where we are now. People who were illiterate and didn't have any money would often put their pennies together for the shilling part and have it read by somebody who was literate at a bar, at a pub. Well, we've got some water here, but let's imagine this is a family setting. We're about to give you just a few pages from his cut version of Scene from David Copperfield. And this is when David is already a young student of the law, and he's run into his old friend from boys' school, Tommy Traddles, who is now living with the family, the Micawbers, chronically improvident, always getting into financial trouble and then out of it. Tommy Traddles is staying with them, and David decides one evening to put together a little party at his rooms for his friends. And we begin, as David makes plans, with his landlady, Mrs. Krupp. And so now Dickens begins. Informing Mrs. Krupp that I wish to entertain at dinner next day, my esteemed friends, Traddles and Mr. and Mrs. Micawber. And I took the liberty of suggesting a pair of soles, a small leg of mutton, and a pigeon pie. Mrs. Krupp broke out into rebellion on my first bashful hint in reference to her cooking the fish in the joint, but in the end a compromise was effected, and Mrs. Krupp consented to achieve this feat on condition that I dine from home for a fortnight afterwards. Having laid in the materials for a bowl of punch, to be compounded by Mr. Micawber, having provided a bottle of lavender water, 2 wax candles, a paper of mixed pins, and a pincushion to assist Mrs. Micawber in her toilette at my dressing table, having also caused the fire in my bedroom to be lighted for Mrs. Micawber's convenience, and having laid the cloth with my own hands, I awaited the result with composure. At the appointed time, my 3 visitors arrived together. Mr. Micawber, with shirt collar more than usual and a new ribbon to his eyeglass, Mrs. Micawber with her cap in a parcel, Traddles, David's doing 2 roles, Traddles carrying the parcel and supporting Mrs. Micawber on his arm. They were all delighted with my residence. When I conducted Mrs. Micawber to my dressing table and she saw the scale on which it was prepared for her, she was in such raptures that she called Mr. Micawber to come in and look.
My dear Copperfield, said Mr. Micawber, this is luxurious. This is a way of life which reminds me of the period when I was myself in a state of celibacy. I am at present established on what may be designated as a small and unassuming scale, but you are aware that I have, in the course of my career, surmounted difficulties and conquered obstacles. You are no stranger to the fact that there have been periods of my life when it has been requisite that I should pause until certain expected events turn up, when it has been necessary that I should fall back before making what I trust I shall not be accused of presumption in terming a spring. The present is one of those momentous stages in the life of man. You find me fallen back for a spring, and I have every reason to believe that a vigorous leap will shortly be the result.
I informed Mr. Micawber that I relied upon him for a bowl of punch and led him to the lemons. I never saw a man so thoroughly enjoy himself as he stirred and mixed and tasted and looked as if he was making not mere punch, but a fortune for his family, down to the last posterity. As to Mrs. Micawber, I don't know whether it was the effect of the cap, or the lavender water, or the pins, or the fire, or the wax candles, but she came out of my room, comparatively speaking, lovely. I suppose, I never ventured to inquire, but I suppose that Mrs. Krupp, after frying the soles, was taken ill. Because we broke down precisely at that point. The leg of mutton came up very red inside and very pale outside, besides having a foreign substance of a gritty nature sprinkled over it as if it had fallen into the ashes. But we were not in a condition to judge of this fact from the appearance of the gravy, for as much as it had been dropped on the stairs.
My dear friend Copperfield, said Mr. Micawber, accidents will occur in the best regulated families, and especially in families not regulated by that pervading influence which sanctifies while it enhances the, I would say, in short, by the influence of woman in the lofty character of wife. If you will allow me to take the liberty of remarking that there are a few comestibles better in their way than a devil, and that I believe with a little division of labor we could accomplish a good one if the young person in attendance could produce a gridiron, I would put it to you that this little misfortune may be easily repaired.
There was a gridiron in the pantry on which my morning rasher of bacon was cooked. We had it out in a twinkling. Traddles cut the mutton into slices. Mr. Micawber covered them with pepper, mustard, salt, and cayenne. I put them on the gridiron, turned them with a fork, and took them off under Mr. Micawber's direction, and Mrs. Micawber heated some mushroom ketchup in a little saucepan.
Punch, my dear Copperfield, said Mr. Micawber, tasting it as soon as dinner was done, is time and tide, waits for no man. Ah, it is at the present moment in high flavor. My love, will you give me your opinion?
Mrs. Micawber pronounced it excellent.
As we are quite confidential here, Mr. Copperfield, said Mrs. Micawber, sipping her punch, Mr. Traddles, being a part of our domesticity, I should much like to have your opinion on Mr. Micawber's prospects. I have consulted branches of my family on the course most expedient for Mr. Micawber to take, and it was that he should immediately turn his attention to coals.
To what, ma'am?
To coals, to the coal trade. Mr. Micawber was induced to think on inquiry that there might be an opening for a man of his talent in the Medway coal trade. Then, as Mr. Micawber very properly said, the first step to be taken clearly was to go and see the Medway, which we went and saw. I say we, Mr. Copperfield, for I never will desert Mr. Micawber. I am a wife and mother, and I never will desert Mr. Micawber.
Traddles and I murmured our admiration.
That, said Mrs. Micawber, that, at least, is my view, my dear Mr. Copperfield and Mr. Traddles, of the obligation which I took upon myself when I repeated the irrevocable words, "Hi, Emma, take thee, Wilkins." I read the service over with a flat candle on the previous night, and the conclusion I derived from it was that I never could or would desert Mr. Micawber.
My dear, said Mr. Micawber, a little impatiently, I am not conscious that you are expected to do anything of the sort.
We went, repeated Mrs. Micawber. And we went and saw the Medway. My opinion of the coal trade on that river was that it might require talent, but that it certainly requires capital. Talent, Mr. Micawber has. Capital, Mr. Micawber has not. We saw, I think, the greater part of the Medway, and that was my individual conclusion. My family were then of opinion that Mr. Micawber should turn his attention to corn on commission. But corn, as I have repeatedly said to Mr. Micawber, may be gentlemanly, but it is not remunerative. Commission, to the extent of 2 and 9 in a fortnight, cannot, however limited our ideas, be considered remunerative.
We were all agreed upon that.
Then, said Mrs. Micawber, who prided herself on taking a clear view of things and keeping Mr. Micawber straight by her woman's wisdom, when he might otherwise go a little crooked. Then I naturally look round the world and say, what is there in which a person of Mr. Micawber's talent is likely to succeed? And here is Mr. Micawber, without any suitable position or employment. Where does that responsibility rest? Clearly on society. Then I would make a fact so disgraceful known and boldly challenge society to set it right. It appears to me, my dear Mr. Copperfield, that what Mr. Micawber has to do is throw down the gauntlet to society and say, in effect, show me who will take that up. Let the party immediately stand forward. It appears to me that what Mr. Micawber has to do is to advertise in all the papers to describe himself plainly as so-and-so, with such and such qualifications, and to put it thus: now, employ me on remunerative terms and address post-paid to WM, Post Office, Camden Town. For this purpose, I think Mr. Micawber ought to raise a certain sum of money on a bill. If no member of my family is possessed of sufficient natural feeling to negotiate that bill, then my opinion is that Mr. Micawber should go into the city, should take that bill into the money market, and should dispose of it for what he can get.
I felt, but I'm sure I don't know why, that this was highly self-denying and devoted in Mrs. Micawber, and I uttered a murmur to that effect. Traddles, who took his tone from me, did likewise. And really, I felt that she was a noble woman, the sort of woman who might have been a Roman matron and done all manner of troublesome, heroic public actions. In the fervor of this impression, I congratulated Mr. Micawber on the treasure he possessed. So did Traddles. Mr. Micawber extended his hand to each of us in succession and then covered his face with his pocket handkerchief, which I think had more snuff upon it than he was aware of. He then returned to the punch in the highest state of exhilaration. It was between 10 and 11 o'clock when Mrs. Micawber rose to replace her cap in the parcel and to put on her bonnet. Mr. Micawber took the opportunity to slip a letter into my hand with a whispered request that I would read it at my leisure. I also took the opportunity of my holding a candle over the banisters to light them down. When Mr. Micawber was going first, leading Mrs. Micawber, to detain Traddles for a moment on the top of the stairs. Traddles, Mr. Micawber don't mean any harm, but if I were you, I wouldn't lend him anything.
My dear Copperfield, I haven't got anything to lend.
Got a name, you know.
Oh, you call that something to lend?
Certainly.
Oh, yes, to be sure. I'm very much obliged to you, Copperfield, but I'm afraid I've lent him that already.
With a bill that is to go into the money market?
No, not for that one. This is the first I've heard of that one. I have been thinking that he will most likely propose that one on the way home. Mine's another.
I hope there'll be nothing wrong with it.
I hope not. I should think not, though, because he told me only the other day that it was provided for. That was Mr. Micawber's expression. Provided for.
Mr. Micawber, looking up at this juncture, I had only time to repeat my caution. Traddles thanked me and descended. But I was much afraid when I observed the good-natured manner in which he went down with Mrs. Micawber's hat in his cap in his hand, that he would be carried into the money market, neck and heels. I returned to my fireside and read Mr. Micawber's letter, which was dated an hour and a half before our dinner. I'm not sure whether I've mentioned that when Mr. Micawber was at any particularly desperate crisis, he used a sort of legal phraseology, which he seemed to think equivalent to winding up his affairs. This was the letter.
Sir, for I dare not say, my dear Copperfield, it is expedient that I should inform you that the undersigned is crushed. Some flickering efforts to spare you the premature knowledge of his calamitous position you may observe in him this day, but hope has sunk beneath the horizon, and the undersigned is crushed. The present communication is penned within the personal range, I cannot call it the society, of an individual in a state closely bordering on intoxication, employed by a broker. That individual is in legal possession of the premises, under a distress for rent. His inventory includes not only the chattels and effects of every description belonging to the undersigned as yearly tenant of this habitation, but also those appertaining to Mr. Thomas Traddles, lodger, and member of the Honorable Society of the Inner Temple. If any drop of gloom were wanting in the overflowing cup, which is now commended, in the language of an immortal writer, to the lips of the undersigned, it would be found in the fact that a friendly acceptance granted to the undersigned by the before-mentioned Mr. Thomas Traddles for the sum of £23 4 shillings 9 1/2 is overdue and is not provided for, Also in the fact that the living responsibilities clinging to the undersigned will, in the course of nature, be increased by the sum of one more helpless victim, whose miserable appearance may be looked for in round numbers at the expiration of a period not exceeding 6 lunar months from the present date. After premising this much, it would be a work of supererogation to add that dust and ashes are forever scattered on the head of Wilkins Micawber.
Now, to wind up our affairs, and before we send you off to refreshments and to see the exhibition, and since the exhibition is in our reading room, we would ask that you view the exhibition either before or after you enjoy your cup, yes, of Mr. Micawber's punch. Here's an introduction to the exhibition by co-curators John Pfordresher, who we've already met, and Karen O'Connell, curator of rare books and preservation coordinator for the Special Collections Research Center. In addition to Victorian literature and the history of the formation of Georgetown's rare book collections, Karen is particularly interested in the book arts, including book illustration and the study and art of book bindings. John and Karen.
Are you comfortable there, Karen? There?
Sure.
We'll just talk briefly. We just wanted to talk you through what we've been working on for quite a while. So I'm going to say a few words, and Karen is, and then I'll say a few words more, and then we'll be ready for the Q&As. When John and I, and then John and Karen and I first talked about this project, we were aware and very interested in what Leona and Artemis were interested in, which was the fact that Dickens had visited here. We thought this was a wonderful small bit of Georgetown history. And so when you see the exhibit, you'll see that it begins with Dickens' visit to Georgetown, and you'll see first editions of his American Notes. You'll see a reproduction of the house diary for the day that he showed up. And also, thanks to the help of the university archivist, we have some wonderful bits and pieces of Georgetown in the 1840s, of the Georgetown that Dickens visited. So you'll see a painting that depicts it, a ground plan. You'll see some of the elements of the graduation from July of 1842, shortly after his visit, and get a sense for the boys and the Jesuits and how things were at that time. And then Karen's going to tell you a bit about this extraordinary gift that came to Georgetown in the 1970s.
That's right. Arnold U. Ziegler, collector and a businessman for quite a long time, was asked by his daughter, I believe in 1956, what he wanted most for Christmas. And his answer was an original copy of Dickens. And that's what he got for Christmas in 1956, a first edition of Dickens' last novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, which we do have on display. In 1976, 20 years later, Mr. Ziegler's children generously gave this wonderful collection, which had grown to more than 1,500 items of almost all of the first editions of Dickens, especially the original parts. Loads of supporting material on Dickens, original illustrations by artists like Cruikshank, original letters written by Dickens about issues like copyright, which is still on our minds today and on display, and just an amazing research opportunity. And over the years, the collection has been added to, including the manuscript copy for Mark Lemon's play, Mr. Nightingale's Diary, and related ephemera. My own Dickens-related acquisitions, I was thinking back to what captured me when I was learning about Dickens, and also thinking about how we teach Dickens and how in special collections we want to give the experience of what it's like to read in the 19th century. Dickens read Penny Dreadfuls, and we know that he read The Terrific Register. One of his novels Pickwick Papers was made into a penny dreadful, The Penny Pickwick. And we do have that instead of 20 parts in 112 parts for A Penny of Line. Not on exhibition, but if you'd like to see it, I'd be happy to show it to you. I also wanted to think a little bit about, and I know that our time is short, but the mind of the collector, which is a little bit of a sub-theme, I think, in the exhibition. And thinking about why do people collect. And if you'll indulge me, I'll just read a little bit from G. Thomas Tansel, a bibliographer, on the psychology of collecting. And he writes, when one tries to identify human needs, one is bound to hear in the back of one's mind Lear's "O reason not the need." The possessions not strictly necessary for bodily survival nevertheless may seem required for establishing a sense of human identity and defining one's place in the world. And those persons or families who lose their accumulated store of objects through fires, storms, robberies, and other catastrophes generally find that their feelings of good fortune in still being alive are naggingly tempered by their sense of deprivation, since they are not as fully alive without the objects that they have made part of their existence. It is unwise, then, to complicate a definition of collecting with the idea of need, not only because need is so difficult to pin down, but also, and more significantly, because all forms of amassing objects can, in fact, be necessities of life, if the role of emotional well-being and physical survival is adequately taken into account. Indeed, it is not unreasonable to claim that the possession of objects is, for everyone, an essential element of life's support. So without this amassing of tangible things, there would be no preservation of the primary sources of history. And as librarians, we connect people with knowledge. Arnold Ziegler's collection connects scholars with the tangible experience of the past and allows them to transform knowledge into wisdom. And so let us end today. Well, no, we can't end yet. You have to
Okay.
I thought I was going last.
Thank you very much. I think we've tried to give the visitor a palpable sense of Mr. Ziegler and through what he collected, and I think you'll get a feel for it. This was all done when Joe Jeffs was the librarian here, and it's a great treasure that he and his staff brought to Georgetown. The ensuing cases display the work of Georgetown faculty, both as researchers and as teachers. And with the work of each one of those Georgetown teacher researchers, we have clustered various books from the Ziegler collection which are related to them. And then dear Paul Betts brought 3 treasures from his collection to illustrate his work as a collector. And you're going to be fascinated to see what he's sharing with us. In the very last case, we carry that, Karen and I, not the royal we carry that forward into thinking about how the practice of teaching Dickens today is going forward. And so we have a case devoted to a seminar that I was lucky enough to lead in the fall of this academic year. And so you'll see the students and their papers and the books they studied. So that we start with Dickens' visit and his comments on the students, and we move through the acquisition of the Ziegler collection to the work of many people, who students and faculty at Georgetown, and end with what's quite current. Dickens, I want to pick up, your presentation was so wonderful, Leona, and the resurrection at the end. Dickens is alive in some ways, and he's alive in the midst of the classroom, and he will continue to be so. So that's what you'll see when you get a chance to go to the exhibit.
Yeah.